Good afternoon. My name is Mark Orr and I'm the Executive Director of the UK and Ireland Spill Association. And I'd like to welcome you to this first webinar that we've done, but particularly the first one that we've done on the MV Wakashio incident. And in this webinar, we want to explore really how spill response principles were applied to it. The incident is recent, it's unfinished, so we cannot expect to draw anything from it that is conclusive. As much about the cause of the original grounding is not known, and we have no details of the Mauritian government response to the incident. However, what is obvious is the harm that this incident has done to a pristine part of the world that is in a unique environmental setting. And as spill responders, we'd all ask, just how was this allowed to happen? So the UK and Ireland Spill Association has been involved in spill response for many, many years. It's the trade body for marine and inland response companies in the United Kingdom. It represents contractors, manufacturers, and consultants. It also runs an accreditation activities under our own scheme for inland and oil and chemical spills, and we deliver the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency scheme for the accreditation of Marine Spill Response Organisation through our accreditation body, International Spill Accreditation Scheme. Okay, so here we have a trade association talking about a maritime incident. So we're not here to say what went right and what went wrong with this incident. I mean, it's far too early for that, because there is far from a conclusion to any of the incident at the moment. So our purpose is to present the timelines, the actions taken, and allow you, the audience, to decide against your experience and your training what may have been done better. We just want to share the learning that may come from an incident like this, particularly while it's current. I suspect there's none of us were there having to juggle conflicting priorities, working against the clock, lacking full information, that we do not know the pressures involved in making decisions and taking action, no doubt, taken at the time in the best interests of health and the environment. So let's look at the vessel itself. The MV Wakashio is described as a Cape-sized bulk carrier. It was delivered in May 2007. It has a deadweight tonnage of 203,000 tons, a length of virtually 300 meters and a beam of 50 meters. She was owned by Wakashio Maritime, an associate company of Nagashiki Shipping, but was being operated at the time by Mitsui OSK Lines, and she was registered in Panama. So for the last 6 months, she's been moving across to and from Australia, carrying product into Japan and product into China. Her last tasking was to drop product off in China, and then she was going in ballast to Baroa in Brazil, and she was due to reach there on the 13th of August. She entered the Indian Ocean on the 16th of July. She adjusted her course on the 21st of July, and she entered Mauritius waters. She entered Mauritius waters on the 23rd of July at 23:42. And she struck the reef on the southeast coast of Mauritius on the 25th of July at 19:15. There was no apparent reduction in speed or heading prior to the impact with the reef. At the time, the wave height was 5 to 7 meters and visibility was reasonable. Initially, there were local patrol vessels along the coast who attended the vessel. On the 26th of July, the Boca Exhibition departed UAE on the 29th of July. So the grounding a day past one, G+1, and I'm going to refer to G+1, which is grounding +1 in this case. On the 28th of July, the Minister of the Environment reported to the Mauritian Parliament on the 28th of July that the vessel's hull was intact, which would make it easier to refloat. but the ruptured hose had flooded the engine room. The crew remained on board, and Smith Salvage and a local contractor, Silero, had been appointed to handle the incident. He said at the time, "My ministry, in line with the National Oil Spill Contingency Plan, has already established contact with authorities in Reunion via the French embassy for support as part of the regional pollution, the maritime pollution plan, whenever this need arises. It is to be noted that such a request is triggered in the event of a major spill of the order of 10 metric tons and above," he said. But in terms of pollution risk, the minister said that although the vessel was not carrying any cargo, it had around 3,900 tons of low sulfur fuel oil, 207 tons of diesel, and 90 tons of lubricating oil on board. At the time, there were no signs of oil spillage, but traces of hydrocarbons had been found on algae over an area of around 300 meters. These are believed to have come from the engine room. In addition, booms had been laid as a precautionary measure to prevent any oil spillage into the nearby Blueberry Marine Park, a protected area that is a short distance south of the grounding site. The minister reported that Smith Salvage, working with the local ship agent and logistics provider Silero, had been appointed to refloat the vessel and contain and manage any pollution. He said that 2 tugs would be involved in the operation, one of which was coming from South Africa and the other from Singapore. The latter, carrying oil spill response equipment, was expected on site on the 29th of July. On the 29th of July, a larger Coast Guard vessel arrived on the scene. On the 31st of July, the Stanford Hawk departed the capital city, Port Louis, and arrived on the station that day. And on the 31st of July, a team of experts from Smith Salvage boarded the vessel to inspect it, assess the situation, organize operations to pump the oil out of the vessel's tanks, and indeed to refloat the vessel. So there's a number of questions which have to be asked, and we'll carry on doing it in this way. Why did the vessel change course to pass so close to the island in daylight, in moderate seas, and not route further south? What contact was there between the vessel and the shore during the last 36 hours when she was so obviously off track and also in Mauritian waters? And who authorized various course changes as she approached the shallow waters by the island, and why? So what happened locally? The Coast Guard visited the Wakashio on the 26th of July. The crew were COVID tested. The Coast Guard agreed with the ship that the crew should stay on board, and they nor the vessel was not in immediate danger. So what else happened during this time? On the 1st of August, this is the position that the ship was now in. And importantly, between her grounding and the 1st of August, there were 6 days where she drifted and eventually started to pound on the reef and eventually ended up stern onto the reef. So in all this time, she was just basically being buffeted by the wind and the storm that came through, and no vessels of any size or consequence went to her aid to stabilize her. So what's clear is that no attempt was made to stabilize the vessel, keeping the bow onto the reef during the heavy weather. We don't know what attempts were made during those days to remove fuel from the lower fuel tanks to other compartments on the vessel that were less vulnerable to pounding on the reef. We're not clear of what was happening on shore. Was any preparation undertaken in case of a spillage taking place? Possibly, apart from laying some booms around the Bloom Bay Marine Park, but the general direction, what was done to cover the downwind threat of any spillage coming from the vessel. And also, from what we've seen, was the pollution response plan really rolled into action to protect any vulnerable sites? Because on the 6th of August, the first spillage was sighted. And you can see here in graphic red exactly where it goes. So on the morning of the 6th of August, oil leaked out of a fuel tank. On the same day, a command post was set up by the French prefect for the South Indian Ocean Defence and Security Zone, gathering various stakeholders together. The Prime Minister Pravind Kumar Jugnauth declared a state of emergency, environmental emergency, and formally requested French help on the 7th of August. And on the 7th of August, the spill response equipment and French experts from the naval base were mobilized, and they arrived on the island on the 8th. So really then the environmental issue, the consequences of this spillage turn it from being just a maritime incident into being an environmental incident. And you can see, and you would have seen many, many pictures of the significant spread of what in marine pollution terms would be a relatively small amount of product which has been lost. But actually its impact was significant. On the 7th of August, 2 tankers, the MT Malise and the Tresta Star, departed Port Louis and arrived next to the Wakashio on the 8th. And you can actually see them alongside in this picture. Now, in fairness to everybody involved, up until that time, the weather had been pretty fierce, albeit one does wonder why tankers weren't standing by earlier. And in this picture here, you can see the tanker alongside. You can see the attempts being made to move product into IBCs. The IBCs at this time were holding a reasonable quantity of fuel, which had been taken, we understand, from the lower fuel tanks and being stockpiled on board. And some of this was being lifted off by helicopter when enabled. But again, some of it was being pumped off onto the nearby tanker. And these efforts continued until the 10th. On the 10th of August, the Prime Minister said that the vessel was likely to break up, and the worst case of scenario is likely to happen, and the boat will fail. So what was happening ashore at this time? An enormous amount, actually. It seems that the nation mobilized very, very quickly to start to pull together to respond to an incident not of their making. And an enormous effort went into making what are called bagasse booms. Now, bagasse booms, and they are allowed for in the pollution response plan, are homemade booms using drums as buoyancy, lots and lots of sugarcane vegetation stuffed into them, together with hair, together with anything which could act as something around which the oil could be contained. And it was actually a national effort which enabled all this to happen. And I do love this little video.
L'équipe d'Azuré en place pour le lever de Godard. Top départ. Wouhou! 1, 2, 3, je peux vous attendre. Eh oh! Eh oh! On rentre du boulot. Eh oh!
I think it's great, don't you?
L'équipe d'Azuré!
So it was a real team effort. Local people, fishermen, people who were NGOs who were working on the island, all of this effort was being coordinated almost aside from anything that government was doing. And these booms were being deployed to try to do what they could to protect their communities from from the increasing threat of the loss of product coming from the Wakashio. And I think it was absolutely commendable that these efforts were done. We don't really know yet exactly how much of this was being, how many booms were manufactured and where they were all deployed. But that will come clear over time. But it was a considerable national effort. What else was happening ashore? So this is the sort of pleas that were going on, and it was a fantastic effort. Already people were trying to do what they could to collect oil. They had drums, they had whatever they could. And you can see this. We need volunteers. Bosses will run from. Fantastic stuff. But the impact of the spill was considerable, and in a very short space of time, driven by the onshore winds, which was pushing that low sulfur fuel oil inshore. And it was horrific. These are not some of the brilliant best pictures, but I'm sure you've seen many of them. There's a number of questions which have to be asked. Just exactly where was the capability which had been invested in over the prior 20 years? And you can see here that a lot of money had been floated in the direction of Mauritius, and at times Mauritius was seen as, you know, a real star of pollution response within the Indian Ocean. But where did it go? So on the 10th of August, the Wakashio starts to break up. Prime Minister tells the nation, expect the worst. Oil spreads further. The spread spreads further as the hull breaches further. Smith Salvage on the 12th announced that pumping operations were complete. In other words, they'd got out all they thought they were going to get out. The same day, representatives of one of the shoreline cleanup contractors appointed, La Flotte Pollution, who were contracted by the ship owner, arrive on site. You can see the degree of tearing which is going on in the hull. And then on the 15th of August, a crack in cargo hold number 8 to the starboard side of the vessel worsened. And around 4:30 p.m, a major detachment of the vessel forward section was observed. It's estimated that a further 90 tons of fuel was still on board at the time of the separation, and the bow section was taken under tow. And this is a picture which I'm sure you've seen, but it's just stark that how a 300-meter ship, ocean-going ship, could fall apart so quickly and break up through pounding on a reef. Amazing. And here you see the bow section under tow and the stern section still firmly attached to the reef. So what is significant, I apologize for this slide, it's almost a little bit out of order, but never mind. That's where the spill had moved to at this stage. You can see the Wakashio down at the bottom of the picture, and you can see now that the contamination is moving, driven primarily by the wind, down along the southeastern coast of the island of Mauritius. Now, just inland of where the Mauritius is sited, you'll notice there's a green island. That island is really an island which sits on top of coral and is a really pristine nature reserve. And at this stage, many people were working hard to try to make a safe evacuation of some of the precious wildlife species which exist only on that island. And it is to be said that along this coastline, there is a lot of very unique and protected habitats, which at this stage were extremely poorly protected. Now, on the 24th of August, in agreement with the ship owners and the Mauritian government, the bow section was sunk just inside Mauritius waters. And a statement was issued by Nagasaki Shipping, At approximately 00:30 hours local time on August the 19th, the forward section of the hull was successfully refloated and towed offshore to an area designated by the authorities. After that, they moved to the sea area designated by the Mauritius authorities to sink the hull and started work at 2100 hours local time on the 21st of August. And at 1500 local time, 24th of August, the front part of the hull was submerged and allowed to sink in the designated sea area of Mauritian territorial waters in accordance with instructions from the authorities. And there's two views on this. Surely we shouldn't be polluting the environment, such a pristine environment, and that we should be salvaging the rest of the vessel and it should be taken away for scrapping. On the contrary side, I think experienced mariners might say, hang on a minute, you're going to tow this where and who's going to accommodate it, and how are you going to manage to to chop that up and recycle it? Lots of questions will come back on that, I'm sure. But fairly immediately after that, you had some wildlife impacts beginning to appear, which the local people, and I think a number of the environmental NGOs, in NGOs would say, there were dolphins and whales, 18 dolphins and whales washed up dead on the Mauritian shores. And by the 28th of August, this had increased to 39 whales and dolphins, which had been washed up on the Mauritian shores. And the local people and the opposition parties link this directly to the pollution on the Wakashio, and they link it also directly to the sinking of the hull where they did. So on the 29th of August, a series of protests started. Around 150,000 people protest against the government's response to the oil spill and question its general competence. Now, you may recall that these were replicated around the world by Mauritians living overseas, and they all protested outside their local embassies. And these then started to become a weekly event, and where the people were uniting to protect where they'd united to protect their island against the oil spill. They felt let down by the government, which had decided to withdraw from representation of the people. There was a strong sense about outrage being expressed against the government, which had manifested itself in the failings of the Wakashio spill. And sadly, on the 31st of August, we had the first deaths related to the incident. The tug Sagate and Duval, which is the tug on the right of this shot, collided with the barge it was towing, which was full of contamination recovered from the Wakashio incident. It overturned, and initially 4 of the 8 crew died, but in fact, I believe that only 1 person survived from this. Now, it was routed to the east of the island and not the west, in stormy weather, and perhaps it was the weather which caused those deaths, and one has to ask why. Now, on the 9th of September, the Panama Maritime Authority, who were on the island at this time, and delivered their initial report, which was very critical of the level of seamanship in the hours leading to the grounding. The vessel deviated from its approved navigation plan, and the captain authorized the approach closer to the shore to gain telephone and internet signal for his crew. He, the first officer, and the chief engineer were on the bridge at the time that the vessel ran aground. Quite incredible. And you have to ask, why on earth did such an incident happen? So, what's going to happen next? Compensation. Well, this is now a big incident with, it said, around 24 kilometers of coastline which has been contaminated. There's further work to be done in covering the booms, the bagasse booms, the considerable amount of effort which will need to be invested in cleaning this up properly. So the compensation claim, apart from just the loss of the vessel, will be considerable. So on the 11th of September, Japan's Mitsui O.S.K. lines, and remember they were operating the vessel, said it would spend about 1 billion yen, 9.4 million, on measures to help Mauritius, including the cleanup of the island's mangrove forests, and contribute to an environmental recovery fund. Now, 9.4 million, with respect, isn't going to touch the cost of this spill cleanup. According to Todo Law Office in Tokyo, Mauritius had ratified the 1976 version of the law related to the loss of vessels, which limits payments to 2 billion yen, $18.7 million. While Japan had signed the 1996 version of this legislation, which had an upper limit of 7 billion yen, so really 3 times greater than the compensation to which Mauritius was entitled by the agreements that it had signed. Further, the Wakashio was insured by the Japanese P&I Club, and a spokesman for that club said that it was trying to make internal estimates for how much the cleanup would cost. Now, if the Japanese P&I Club accept that they are as a group liable for it, they could cover up to $1 billion. Now, we don't know what it's going to cost. And it is thought that because all the parties involved, the owner of the vessel, the charter of the vessel, and the operator of the vessel were all Japanese companies, that they may be able to call on as much as $1 billion. So, moving on. So let's look at the spill response principles involved in this. In simple terms, the principles would be to contain or remove the source. And I think there is real issues over this, because as soon as the vessel grounded, very few vessels attended it. The Coast Guard came on board by helicopter and were lifted off on board. There were concerns over COVID, but basically the vessel was left for 6 days to move around the reef and basically ended up stern onto the reef. And once it was stern onto the reef, its fate was possibly sealed. So then, whilst the vessel was breaking up on the reef, they started to remove the source. There's little evidence, there is evidence through the pictures that you've seen, that there was some containment being done by putting some of the oil on board into IBCs. But actually, if you've got if you've got 9,000 tons of product on board, you need a lot of IBCs. Why wasn't a tanker alongside earlier? Or why wasn't there some mechanism to actually start moving oil out of the tanks where it was vulnerable and into other containers or containering of some sort on board the vessel? This would at least have helped to either contain the source or help to remove the source from the vulnerable areas, which eventually split on the 6th of August. Also, we would say, what was done to mitigate any potential loss? It must have been fairly obvious that the vessel was in severe difficulties, being stern on and vulnerable, being stern on to the coral reef. And maybe Smith Salvage were ambitious in expecting it to be recoverable on when they visited the vessel on the 31st of July. But what was actually being done to protect against any further spread? It's clear, and we've seen evidence, that there was booming to protect the Blue Bay Marine Park. But actually that wasn't perhaps as vulnerable as the other coastline, which is directly downwind. And I know that there were, in all, it is said some 3 kilometers of booms were deployed, but actually it wasn't until the gas booms were deployed that actually a lot of other areas were protected. But by then, a lot of the harm had been done. And you've seen that in the pictures of the oil in the mangroves. So whilst the bagasse booms held product at sea, they were being deployed as it was already flowing towards the shores. And so really protection of the vulnerable environments wasn't perhaps as well arranged as it possibly could have been. So there's lots and lots to be learned out of this. And I summarize these as spill responders, we need to look at incidents and we need to learn from them. That's the purpose of why we've done this webinar, and we will do many others. The next is really, this is one of the first spills which has been in the public eye involving very low sulfur fuel oil, which is obviously a fuel oil which is being introduced as part of the to reduce the pollution emitted at sea by the burning of other oils, and in particular reducing its sulfur content. So it'll be very interesting to see how this reacts in the marine environment. There's some learning to be done from that. This is the first incident. This has also happened under COVID, and COVID is with us now, and it looks like it could be with us for a while yet. So there must be some learning to be taken out of that. There's also learning of, you know, what do nations do when rogue vessels who are deviating from their agreed navigation plan close with your shore? What level of intervention can you exert? Or do you just ultimately rely on a rogue vessel appearing on their shore? It is important to note that this is not the first vessel which has landed on Mauritian's shore, much to their chagrin. They had another incident, the MV Benito, which occurred in June 2016. It went aground not too far from the site of the Wakashio. So that eventually, I believe, was pulled off. But what lessons were learned from that? And why weren't they applied to this? I would also say that, you know, we're looking at this from afar, and we weren't there on the ground at the moment. It's waste, you know, and it's in Mauritius, which during COVID is not easy to get to. And I know that people who've been out of there have found it very hard to get into the country because of limited numbers of flights, the necessity to quarantine on arrival, and the necessity to work in a COVID safe, to work safely with COVID around. So there's a lot which is going to be learned out of this. How the local people at the moment, who are primarily fishing, rely on fishing, and they rely on tourism, don't have tourism because of COVID, but also they aren't able to fish. So how is the degree of loss in this incident going to be assessed, and how is it going to be mitigated? Now we've got roughly 8 tons of product, 8,000 tons of product, which is floating to the shore. The waste management involved in the recovery of that, the processing of that, is considerable. And how is Mauritius going to manage to manage the waste which is going to be arising? And how will it be disposed of? There is an enormous amount of learning to come out of this incident. And I hope that you found this gallop through this incident interesting, and I hope that this proves of some benefit to the spill community. And I thank you for joining us today, and I hope that we can continue to share this information with you. So on behalf of UK and Ireland Spill Association, I'd like to thank you for joining. We will be putting updates on LinkedIn, on our Twitter account, and on our website, which is shared with you there. So thank you very much for joining, and have a good evening.